Hello, everyone. As you may know by now, my name is Alanis Gonzalez, and today I will be presenting my research project, Viewing Art History Beyond Western Lens, a study of the art history curriculum in the state of Florida. That is a mouthful, but I promise it's very specific, so at least you might know what it's about. So what we're going to talk about is what are Western lens, why is discerning this bias important, and this meaning of Western bias? How do we discern this bias? Because it's something that's easy to say, but hard to prove. What are some possible reasons for this bias, and what should we do to mitigate it? So these are a series of questions that will show what we will be talking about in this presentation, but there is one more pressing question that you might all be thinking right now, which is, who cares? Like, this is a very niche and overly academic subject. So how is this relevant to our daily lives? And I can answer that question. It's because academic institutions really are just a reflection of the cultural traditions of where you are. So while it might not seem important, art history is definitely not something that people think about every day. Art is something that is reflective of where it's situated, where it's created, and it's history. You know, art history, when people think about it, they usually focus on the art part and not the history part. So while looking at art, we can really understand the people that made it and understand the people today by the way that they interact with it, the way that they present it, and more importantly, the way that they study it. So the first thing that we're going to be looking at is that our Western lens and our Western bias changes the way that we view art and the way that we interact with academia. And by not interacting with any art that isn't Western, then we're limiting the field of study. But you might be asking, what even is Western art? So Western art is the literary, performing, and visual arts of Europe and regions that share a European cultural tradition, including the United States and Canada. And this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it is the best definition that I found. And the reason why this is important to note is because when it says America, it's not actually referring to the United States as a whole, but it said Anglo-Americans, which is just a long word for white Americans. And for the purposes of defining Western art, Latin American, Asian American, and African American art are classified as non-Western because their primary cultural traditions do not lie in where Western art originates, which is Greek and Roman traditions, but instead in Africa, in Asia, and in America, pre-colonial times. So as we said, it limits the field of study and changes what we view as art. Because, oh, I'm pressing the wrong button. Okay.
It's the bottom.
Because when we usually think of art, we're thinking about, Greek sculptures, the Mona Lisa. Because let's be honest, even myself, when I first think of art history, the first thing I tell people is like, no, I'm not going to study the Mona Lisa. And because usually this is what people study, let's be frank. And that kind of raises a question that a lot of people ask is, what is worth studying? Maybe the reason why there's so many like Western art is because maybe that's what they determine is the most refined and most important. But first of all, that's wrong. But second of all, the reason why we think that is because with our Western lens, this is what we determine art is. Because especially you'll notice that when you're studying art in a Western country or in a Eurocentric perspective, you're defining every term using like Western like words. So for example, and I'm taking a non-Western course currently, and the thing that they always say is like, oh, this is like a Colosseum, but we're in Asia. So obviously it's not a Colosseum, but it's the closest thing to a Colosseum. Therefore, this is what we're using to associate it with. However, it has so many different characteristics that we're not thinking about it because we've already categorized it as a Colosseum when that's not what it is. So even with things like that, it's important to know in which way we view things because we might miss a lot of details and a lot of perspectives if we don't really know how we're entering into things. So this is actually a quote from Sydney Rice. She's from it's like this art education center, and it is a bit older, but it is a pretty good source because it stands the test of time. But all objects, regardless of their initial uses, are valuable primarily because of their visual interest. This, however, is distinctively Western Eurocentric in origin, despite their claim of universality. And this actually reminds me of a specific question that I got yesterday, which was, well, why does it matter? Because this African mask, they had a practical use. why should we categorize this as art versus like Greek tattoos that were made with so much refinement and so much care, while this is just a thing that they use. And I was like, it precisely presents the point that I'm trying to get at, is that because of the Eurocentric way that we're viewing things, you're thinking that this is not art because it doesn't fit your usual standard of what you think art is. And that is incredibly limiting into the art that belongs to literally everywhere else in the world. Because Europe is just one small part of it. And what's interesting about non-Western courses is that it's already basing itself on a Eurocentric point of view, because it's like, what's European art and what's not. And it's like, in those courses, you're basically trying to encapsulate the entire history of the world in one class. Whereas in European art classes, you're gonna be studying Greek statues for at least like 3 chapters. So it's like, if you can go that in depth on Greek statues, why not anything else? So the second thing is that it's not representative of US art and its population. And the reason why this is important is because another question that we usually get is, okay, but we're in America, this is a Western country, it would make sense, it would be predominantly Western. But as we mentioned earlier, African American, Latin American, and Asian American art is not considered Western. So we're only focusing on one part of the mosaic that is the American population. And when studying American art, they're actually just focusing on Anglo-American art, which is actually usually made by European artists that come to America. It's not even people that were born in America. So it's like, already we're kind of limiting ourselves by where we are. So we're not even studying the art of where we are, but instead about what our forefathers, which I am sure were not Michelangelo and Raphael and all of these people, but instead the people that actually live here and will continue to create art. And especially in the modern day, it's undeniable that African American, Latin American, and Asian American influences are not only important, but some of the strongest. And then in the terms of this very niche subject, it's a lack of course diversity leads to underservicing student populations for the reasons that we mentioned, and the oversaturation of the field and job market. Because when you have like 10 people specializing in medieval art, of course, there's going to be some competition because that's all that they're studying. And the first thing that people tell me when I tell them that I'm interested in Latin American art is always like, damn, no one does that. And it's like, yeah, because it's so niche that it's like, you stand out just by the fact that you're interested in something else. And then the fourth reason why this is important, and this is a bit more academic, but the bachelor's in art history functions as a general preparation for an advanced degree. So you're gonna go to grad school if you study art history. However, if you're not exposed to everything that there is, of course, you're gonna be delineated towards the path that the cultural institutions prepared you with, which is usually medieval art, Greek and Roman art, and that, like, you know, Rococo and whatever, all that Italian nonsense. And it's like, it doesn't leave room for everyone else. And it also creates like a self-fulfilling prophecy that they just keep churning out the same kind of thing and oversaturates the field. It doesn't really leave opportunity for growth. But how do you even prove this bias? Because as we mentioned earlier, it's easy to say, but hard to prove. So what we did was kind of conduct an experiment, and we took a sample from the State University System of Florida, which is composed of 12 public universities, analyzed the current bachelor's programs to prepare a student for an advanced degree, then quantified the number of catalog offerings of this year, so 2021, 2022, but not only what they offered, but what they required. Because what a lot of schools do is like, oh yeah, no, we offer Asian history, but it's like, do you make people take it? It's like, no. So a student can just feasibly never interact with it if they choose not to, or are just not aware. And then we categorized them into Western, non-specific, meaning that there wasn't any particular region. So it was mostly like theory classes about like the theory of graphic design, and then non-Western, which is anything that is not Europe and Anglo-America. And then we created a graph. And these are the graphs. So Western is red, non-specific is yellow, and orange is non-Western. So as you can see, there is an overwhelming amount of red, and these are the credits that are required. So these are the classes that they have to take. So as you can see, some schools like FTCU and FAU just don't require anything that isn't Western. So a person can just go the entire time without ever interacting with anything outside of Europe. And then some schools like USF, the reason why they don't require anything Western is because they know that their course offerings are overwhelmingly European. So they're gonna inevitably take something that's Western, So they don't require it because it's like, we know you're gonna take it. So might as well require the ones that we know that you might never stumble upon. And then the courses offered, when you look at them, the average distribution is that 52% of the courses are Western, 32% are non-specific, and then 16% are non-Western. And a common trend is that the smaller schools like FECU and FAU have a smaller selection of non-Western because it's just so niche and so hard to find that you need to have ample resources in order to be able to provide them. So schools like UF do have an ample selection of non-Western, but it's not because they necessarily care more or they're just more like active or whatever. It's more so that they have the resources to be able to do it. So how did this even happen? And possible reasons for this bias is the historiography of art history, which means the history of the history, which is very meta. And what this means is that even around the world, in countries in Africa, countries in Asia, people study European art, even though they don't have any connection to the real art of the place that they're in. It's just that the discipline was founded in a very Eurocentric manner, and that's the way that it's been propagated. And then lack of docents in training specializing in non-Western fields. So what we spoke about earlier, there are barely any people specializing in non-Western art. And again, not due to lack of wanting to, just lack of access. And then finally, and most presently, the standardization of Western lens and academic bias towards Western models. But what does this mean? So we use this as kind of this case study, and these two are the main general courses for art history. So you know how all of your majors have those classes that every person in the major has to take no matter where they are in the state. And this is art histories. And the official name in the statewide course numbering system, which is from the Florida Department of Education this year, is Introduction to Art History. So it's already defining it as a general course, non-specific. However, they all have the same outline. And when you look at the outline, the entire thing across all two subjects is Western, save the first chapter, which is in Mesopotamia. And it's like, okay, so we started in Africa, created art, and then we evolved and became Europeans. And it's like, art is not chronological, but instead a cultural phenomenon. So already painting it as a timeline that originated from Africa and then went into everything else is just wrong. And it also perpetuates the belief that non-Western art is primitive or ancient, which is what the guy at the presentation was basically telling me, like, you know, your art is really just, you know, simple. Why would we bother? And it's like, because it's the only art you've ever been exposed to. So of course you're gonna think that the only thing they've ever created is mass when they have a bunch of really cool art. I'm not saying that mass aren't cool, they are. But yeah, when you actually view what universities have done in order to fix this, it was split 50-50 with some of the universities recognizing a Western and some of them as not. And then another reason why this is important is because this is a general education course. So this may be the only exposure to art history that people may ever get in their lives, and are left with the impression that the Mona Lisa and the Greek statues is the epitome of art and never get exposed to anything else. And other fine arts majors like dance, music, and musical theater do have a global component. So why not art history, which is supposed to be the most global and historically accurate major? But what should we do? So mitigating the bias does require, first and foremost, being aware of the bias in the first place and those in academic systems. And thankfully, that is something that academic systems have recognized throughout the years. So the 52%, even though it seems like a lot, is way better than it was at least 10 years ago, where it was, I can bet you, at least 70%. And contribute to future initiatives to expand diversity in the curricula in undergraduate education. And then finally, incentivize the study of the US art and its influences outside of Europe, because we're in America, you know, not to sound patriotic, but it's like, we're in a place that has a lot of different influences, and we're doing a disservice by not studying what makes us us. And that's it. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. Sorry about all the rambling, but thank you.